All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Good to see everybody, those of you here. All right, this week we're going to be going over control structures, and everybody has XAMPP, correct? Either on your computer or on a USB, hopefully. All right, good. Oh, I did put in here in our course conference, I did email everyone and also put our announcements. Wednesday from 6 to 7 for this class is going to be online office hours. When you click on this link, it'll bring you to a module that will basically be able to chat with one another, show you examples via remote control. So whatever help you might need, you can avail yourself of that if you want to. And so I'm also available via email all the time, any code questions you might have. I did decide, because there was a few having issues on uploading your stuff to your external site, I'm going to make that optional, okay? But you do have to turn in your zip file each week, but the optional on the upload for your weekly stuff, I would recommend you doing it, but just I don't want that to hold you back from doing your coding exercises, so I'd rather you get that finished than being hung up on FTP or uploading. I've got 3 students actually in here that are taking this online, so 2 of them are having that issue, and so I told them to just make it optional. But I would recommend doing it. Are you guys that are you able to upload fine your stuff so far that you've been working on?
Yeah.
Keep doing it. I'm just not going to grade off if you don't do it. So, but I would recommend it definitely to do it, because in web programming you're going to have to. It's a must that you have to do it. They've changed some stuff, I guess, in 0.0 web hosts, but I haven't seen any issues personally. But I would say lean towards keep doing it, because for your final site you're going to have to work on it anyway. So, okay, so this week is expression controls reading, PHP control structure, handling dates as far as the reading goes. And the guest book example we're going to create tonight, I'll go ahead and throw that up here. It's a simple web form with first name, last name, email, a button to add contact. It adds a new record, and then they should be able to edit that record. So I'll go ahead and put in a new one here. Okay, there's the new record I just added here at the bottom. Click edit. Then I can go in here and correct my spelling or whatever it is I want to do. Sits there and waits for 5 seconds and redirects back to the home page. Okay? This whole exercise, we'll talk about how it works here in just a second. Look at the code. It uses a couple of things. One is it's going to use a SQL database, MySQL database for the first time. We'll show you how to build that tonight in PHP MyAdmin. And we'll be developing a MySQL database database table, and populating it. And the database is fairly simple. Just a note on database creation is make sure on your databases that you create, or your tables within, specifically your tables within the database, that they are indexed, primary keys, and multiple indexes really would be helpful, but for sure primary key in each one of the tables beneficial, especially when you're dealing with relationships between table to table. And so PHP, though, as far as using MySQL, it's pretty extensive in its use of MySQL as far as the database technology, and a lot of websites use it. As far as the commands go, if you're familiar with SQL at all, the commands are fairly similar, in fact exact with MySQL as SQL. Trying to think of what else. We'll be creating within PHP MyAdmin, I'll show you in just a second how you can create database easily within XAMPP using PHP MyAdmin. Create tables within that. create a user with all global rights and privileges to be able to go in and make any changes they need to make. And as far as the hooks on this database, on this application here, when you hover over the edit link, it gives what we went over last week, or 2 weeks ago actually. We were gone last week. Anybody remember what that is? If I put my mouse over this, if you look in the URL at the top, it says week 3, or take it back down here at the bottom, week 3, edit.php, and then it has here, the question mark ID equals 1. What is that called? And it's a variable, but it's called what? What's the term it's used, remember? Something by reference. Starts with a P. PA. Pass by reference. And so we're passing by reference in the URL. We're passing a reference variable. For in this case, its name is ID of different values. The value refers to the actual index ID of the table, which in this case is an auto increment number starting out with 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. This ID is the name of the actual field in the database, and every time a new record is created, it increments by 1 that record ID, and so when you hover over it, it knows when I click on this, and it's actually redirecting to another PHP page. It does a query on the SQL table and says, I want record 1 of this table. And so it does a where path SQL statement, we'll see in a second, loads in my information. I can change it. When I hit submit, it does an update of that, update SQL statement from whatever changes I might have made. Then it sits there and does a meta tag refresh in PHP for about 5 seconds, and then redirects back to the index page. And you see this done a lot in any type of database where you're having to constantly make changes to profiles, make changes to anything on your website. It does a wait there. Now, is that wait needed as far as, is it needed to work? No, it's not. It's just basically a aesthetic thing that web programmers do. Now, granted, it does help keep, if you can imagine 1,000 people hitting this page at the same time, that wait does help a little bit on the SQL database being hit, a little bit, not too much though. SQL databases can handle a lot. When a web server goes down, it's not because the SQL database is overloaded, it's because the server's overloaded. SQL databases can handle a lot of processing, a lot of connectivity. And so it's not an issue of database handling the speed or being too quick. It's basically just an aesthetic thing to where when it's waiting there for 5 seconds, it's already done the update. It's already done what it's supposed to do on the website as far as the database goes. It's something that is an aesthetic function of web design. You always have on any form where you're updating from a bank form to where you buying tickets online, there's some processing that's happening. It shows you like a spinning wheel or whatever. We've all seen them, right? Is it always doing something when that happens? I'll tell you it's not. 99.9% of the time it's not doing anything but spinning for how many seconds the programmer wants it to spin. Now there are cases and triggers in web development with databases that you can actually tie the spinning to an actual process. But for this small app, that's not the case. What I mean by that is, let's say, an AJAX request would be an example. I'm trying to think of another one. Say you had a humongous query. Say this database was 1 million records. We'll say it's 1 million records. And you had a page in here somewhere where I could query that database, those 1 million records, okay? You would want the wait symbol in that case to actually be tied to the wait symbol within SQL. SQL has a wait status while it's processing that you can actually code in and do a catch on. And so besides that though, most websites that you see spinning happening, it's either an AJAX thing, and AJAX actually is using, those triggers I talked about for beginning transaction and ending transaction. Because in SQL you have a couple commands that are real simple. An open command to open the database, okay? Whatever command you're going to do on the database, let's say a select statement, an update statement, a delete statement, an insert statement. Then you have a commit command where it commits the transaction, and then finally a close command that closes the transaction. So you could have a trigger fire right before or right after, we'll say right after the open database function, and then end at the end when the database closes. So however long that takes, that's how long the spinning function works. You could do that as well for websites that need that. But for the most part, when you see page-to-page spinning, it's usually something like that, some type of timer they put in there, like I've done on this one, just for aesthetic purposes. So let's look at, first of all, I'm going to actually download this config.php file, which is a zip file, is the first thing. And hopefully before class you're doing the reading prior within the reading area. I'm not going to go over that in class per se. I would like to get right into the meat and potatoes of the week, what we're working on. So every database is going to have a config file. And you can open that up with your word processor. I'm going to use Text Wrangler here in the Mac. And while that's loading here, I'm going to go ahead and start up my XAMPP controller. Okay, so every database, before you create it, what I suggest is go ahead and create what that database is going to use as far as connectivity goes. And this is a really basic control, a really basic PHP file for config that can be used in multiple uses on a database site, on a website. If I can pull it up a little bit more. Actually, pull it up this way. I hope it on that. Make it just a little bit bigger. There we go, it's better. Okay, hopefully it's easier to see. All right, so the first line there, I put an equal sign up there for some reason. Actually, line 3, DB host. When you're developing locally on XAMPP, it's always going to be localhost. On your external site, you'll find that information on the control panel for that database, which we'll go over in a second as well for 00 web host. Do what now?
It's usually localhost. Any server have you?
Yep. Well, for the local host here, it would be localhost, but for your external site to talk to that database, it's going to be, for XAMPP, for 00 web host anyway, it's going to be different. We'll go over that. And then your database name, username, and password. And then the next line 7 is your connection string, db_con. Equals MySQL connection. Any blue text you see here is an actual SQL database command that when PHP sees it, it fires that function. The function MySQL connect uses 3 variables, host, username, and password. The next one is a string we're going to use for a MySQL statement, which is a select statement, which in this case is just going to connect to the database. Line 10 It's going to connect the database using the host name, username, and password. Then line 12, it's going to select that database and hold on to it for the remainder of whatever session it is that you're going to use it. Okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and go to Text Wrangler here. I'm going to fire up this week's zip file. If you'll download the source files for week 3 practice lab, where it says download source files week 3 lab, there should be 4 files inside of the zip folder. I want you to go ahead and put it inside of htdocs. I put mine inside of Web 290 labs week 2, but for tonight's exercise, just make sure it's inside of week htdocs so we can get started on it. And I think I have one I call class. I believe I put mine in for our in-class exercises here. So I'm going to copy that zip file. I'm going to go ahead and go into Applications, XAMPP, htdocs. Right inside of htdocs, I have a folder I have called class for our in-class stuff here. And I've already got my information in there. And so just make sure that you put it inside of htdocs in a folder somewhere. If you don't want to put it in Web 290 labs week 3, you don't have to, but for navigation's sake, might be easier. Okay, now you'll notice in the root of my class folder, I have that config file that we looked at earlier. And the reason you want to put, or the benefit of putting a config file in the root of your website is so you can use it throughout your application. You guys are familiar with relative paths, correct? Relative paths when it comes to web design. You've got absolute paths and relative paths. Make sure in PHP for this semester and any website you ever create, always use relative paths as much as you can. Because if you move that site to another server, it'll really save you a lot of time as far as remapping your code. And so what I mean by that is when you guys submit to me your week's assignments each week, I just dump it in a student folder, unzip it and fire it up. And if you have relative paths in your application, it's going to run. Okay? Relative paths all throughout. When you have absolute paths to your hard drive or whatever, that's not going to work too well as far as connectivity goes. So make sure on anything, keep it relative as far as your paths go. So the config.php file that we downloaded, I want you to put whatever folder you're putting your exercise tonight in the htdocs, like mine's called class, I put inside the root of htdocs. I want to put inside of that folder the config file that I had you download. We're going to change the contents of it here in a second. But that config file that we looked at earlier inside of the in-class exercise, which is right here, that zip file. When you download that zip file, make sure and put it at the root of the folder where tonight's lab is located at. So if you, like I said, you put it inside of, I don't know, say this is your computer and here's your htdocs. You put it inside of week 3. That's your project folder for tonight. You're going to go ahead and put in that config file. It's going to be right at the root of, actually in this case, it'd be right at the root of htdocs. Okay. The way I have mine is I've got htdocs, class, and then I have in here, inside of class, I've got week 3, and I put config.php right inside of that class folder. It's in the same path as that class folder, right in the root directory of that class folder. So I've got other weeks in here too. I've got week 2, week 1, Okay? So make sure that config file is one folder back from the folder you have your project in. And what I'd like you to do with that config file, once you have it in that section, in that area, back, let me minimize mine so you can see it. So there's my config file. There's my week 3 I'm working on tonight. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this config file I have open to save confusion. That's the one I downloaded. Let me open that up. Okay, this is what I want everybody to put in for your config file. Let me make the text a little bit bigger here. Okay, so in place of cconcal, you're going to put in your first and last name, basically. Everything else is going to be the same. So in place of cconcal, I want you to put in your first and your last name. Pizza? All right. I think I had a card on there. Is that right? Okay.
And the receipts in the box.
All right. Thanks. Appreciate it. Do you have any plates by chance in your car, or no? You don't? Okay, that's all right. I'll run up and get some. Thanks. Okay, right after we go over this, it's pizza time. All right, then put in your data like I have there. And again, what we're doing is we're creating the config file prior to creating the database that we're going to create, which is going to be called your first initial last name and PHP MyAdmin. Mm-hmm. No. No, not yet. I can't wait till everybody gets there. Now, inside of that, once you've created the changes, go ahead and do if you're on a Mac, Command S, Windows, Control S to save what you've done so far. And the last thing we're going to do, actually, before we run this, is actually create the database. The very last thing we're going to do. We're going to do everything else first. Okay, next thing I want you to do, now that you've got the config file created, what you're going to do is fire up the other 4 files, open those up. So I'm in Text Wrangler. I'm going to go to File, Open, go to my htdocs, class folder, week 3, and there's those 4 files that you downloaded. Contact, edit, index, and update. Open all 4 of them at once in your editor. So you should now have 5 files open in your text editor. Config, contact, edit, index, and update. As soon as all 5 are open, the first one I want you to go to is the index file. The index file. Okay, while you're getting the index file open, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about it. In the index file, which is the default page of the website here, in the folder week 3, it's just creating a simple table guest book, and the form name is people. The action is contact.php. What that means is when they hit the submit button, it's going to go to the contact.php page. The method is post. That means everything they put here in the fields is post enabled, meaning we can take anything that's in these fields and post it to another page. All right, so here's the example here. We have first name, it's a text type. The name for that one, which is important, we'll talk about in a second, is F name. For last name, it's a text type input as well, L name. Email, text type, email's the name on that one. And then lastly, the submit button. The value on that one is add contact. That's what's going to show up as a text property in the button. Make sense so far? Then next one on line 27, we include the config file. Here's where the relative path comes in I was talking about earlier. Open quotes, .. Okay? Every ... in relative environment is a folder back. Okay? Just remember that. ... So if you have two folders back, be ... would be the rendering for that. So it's ... config.php. And what this is for is the include statement, which is the first time we've used it as far as configs go, is it's going to include everything that's in config.php now in our application at this point, which has in it basically the connection information for our database. Now we've grabbed onto the database, but we've not opened it, not done anything with it, we just connected it. Because remember that config file used a username and password. At the end of that config file, if you remember, it did a connection command that just held on to that database. That's all it's doing. So here we get into some SQL stuff. Here we're going to see if people exist, the people table exists. Created a variable called check equals MySQL_query, left parentheses, quote, select all from people in single quotes because it's a string, limit 0, 1. Okay? What this is going to do is it's going to see if one record is coming back from this. The top record of this query is coming back. So it's looking for at least one. If check, meaning the query was legal and the table exists, we're done. We don't need to do anything. But say it doesn't check, meaning it's going to be false, does not exist. Table does not exist for people. Here is a SQL statement to create a people table. Now you can create in PHP MyAdmin, which I'll show you tonight how to do, you can manually create a table within PHP MyAdmin, but the way I've always done it and the way I recommend it is learning how to do it within code, because here's how it happens. Say you create an entire website in PHP, you move it to another server, okay? All you have to do if you move it to another server, and let's say you have a whole new SQL server that you move it to and everything, the whole thing, is redo the information in your config file. Then what this is going to do is create that SQL table people in the database that you've created, whatever that database name is. Because this has nothing to do currently right now with a database. It has to do with a table. Okay? The database is already connected in the config file. So here we have create table people, left parentheses, people underscore end, ID. It's an int with 11, not, that's just a size 11 by the way, which is plenty for this one. Not null, and it's auto increment. What that means is we will never create ID in this database. It'll automatically create it when a new record's created. Let's go on. People underscore fnames of varchars is a string with 32 spaces available. Not null on that one. Next one's people underscore lname, varchar 32 characters available. Not null on that one. Then people underscore email varchar, not null on that one, 32. Primary key, people ID, which is this one right here, and quotes. This next line, results equal MySQL peoples, is running this create statement. If it fails, it'll just die and kill itself and go on. The only way it would fail is if you have some syntax or something wrong here, or there's something wrong with the config file as far as connectivity. Username's wrong, pass name's wrong, database name's wrong. Next one, line 46. So we've created the table. Now we're going to query all the table information. It says here, querying, selecting all from people, which means it's going to select every record from people. Result, it's going to plug in this array by doing MySQL query. It's going to plug in this SQL statement into the result. Then here's your MySQL close statement I talked about earlier. Always remember to put a MySQL close, because if you don't put a MySQL underscore close in your database and you try to use it again, it would say it's already open. Okay? And plus, for transaction purposes on your database, with this small database, it's not going to really matter much, but when you have a database of, like, say, a million records like we talked about earlier, you definitely want to use close statement correctly. Excuse me, in your database connectivity. Now these next few lines populate Now let me ask you this. Say this is the first time this is run. How many records will come back? First time. First time, how many records are we going to get once this table is created? Did we insert any records? No, we just created a table, didn't we? So we just created a table. Nothing's going to show up at first, the first time. So here we have information now coming in. It's echoing a table statement. It's a 400 width table with a one border, cell padding 5, font size is 13, first name, last name, email, edit. Second row is getting to begin to fill the information. So this first bit of information is the header information of the table, which is showing you, again, first name, last name, email, edit. This rest here, this while statement from 58 down to 70 is doing a loop statement. Okay? While row exists, basically. While row exists, there's an array. It's going to keep looping. While that array exists, from 0 to whatever, it's going to continue on. And so we'll say we have one record in here. We'll say we put a record in here. It's going to come back with one result. And what it's going to kick out is row, people name, row, people, F name, people L name, people email. Well, what this is doing is, since it's doing a while loop starting with a 0 record, it knows row is 0. 0, 0 the first time around. Down here, the edit button, all it is ahref equals edit.php question mark ID, doing the reference post by reference, equals dot row people ID, and then the word edit and is going to show up there on the last column on the right. And then finally editing the echoing the table end tag. Okay. Now, contact.php. We'll say we enter some data. It's going to go to contact.php. Let's go there. In contact.php, the very first line includes that config file. The next line, update db equals, now we have an insert statement. So far we've done a create table statement, a select statement. Now we're doing an insert statement into the table. So we're inserting into people underscore F name, people underscore L name, people underscore email. Make sure, just a note, that it's very syntax oriented. So if the database has it spelled like that, put it in the query like that, okay, for your statements. It's going to insert into people table with those three fields, these values. So you have fields, insert into whatever table, the name of the fields, in parentheses, values, and then in parentheses as well, you're going to have those values separated by commas. So we have post F name, post L name, and post email, all separated by commas as the values for those fields. This next line of code is firing that query, that update query. This next line is doing a header redirect immediately back to index. There is no wait on this one. There's no wait statement on this one. We'll see one in just a second. So now let's pretend they clicked on the edit button. Okay, we'll pretend they clicked on the edit button. Let me bring that app up real quick. So we'll pretend they clicked on the edit button. It's going to go to the edit.php page, and remember it's going to reference the ID that they're hovering over for that record. So let's go to the edit.php page. Here we go. In the edit.php page, another first line, including that config file. Now, this line here, line 4, is actually including a git command, which we have used this one already this semester. And the git command for a pass-by reference in a URL gets whatever's in the brackets here that you passed over. In this case, it's ID. So If it's the first record and we only have one record, it's going to be 1. It's going to be carried over here for ID. Then the lines 6, 7, and 8 is going to do a select statement. So select all from people where people ID equals, we'll say 1. It's going to run that query. Then the next one it's going to do is what's called a fetch array. A fetch array is going to take that query and blow it up in one line, in one command, and separate it. So it's going to basically blow up the fields within that query. In this case, the fields are going to be the username or the F name, L name, and email. It's all going to be into num here. So let's look at what's going to happen. On the form, when they click on edit, these 3 fields is what I'm talking about, are now going to be showed up on the form. The form's name is update. Form action is update. It's going to go to the update.php page in just a second. Post method. There is a hidden file in this for the ID that we're going to bring over to the update.php in just a second. And notice, even though it's hidden, the value is being echoed. Okay, so the ID name, it does have a value. In this case, it's probably going to be 1 since it's only one record. Then the next couple lines of code, 3 lines of code, are basically just echoing out that field for that array, that field name for that array. So we have F name, L name, and email. With email, at the end of that, first name, L name, last name, email, you have the submit button. Once the submit button is clicked, after they've made a change, it's going to go to the update.php page. So let's go there. In the update.php page, again, we're including the config file. We're posting in all of the fields, including the ID field. So we have ID, F name, L name, and email, plugged in some local variables, a real simple update statement, updating people, set people F name equals F name, people L name equals L name, people email equals email, where people ID equals ID. On line 11, we blow up that query and do a SQL statement with it. Here's where we do the 4-second redirect. It's a 4-second redirect. I said 5 earlier, but it's 4-second. So there's a 4-second redirect. While it's redirecting and spinning and waiting, it's going to echo out to the page, update complete, please wait. Then it's going to redirect to the index.php page. So let's see it happen. I'm going to go ahead and fix this one here. Submit it. Update complete, please wait. It's on the update.php page. Now it's back to the index page. All right. So, recapping real quick on this one before I go get plates for us, and then we'll talk about it some more after we eat some pizza here. Is you've got the config file, number 1. Number 2, in the config file, you've got the information for the database and username and password. If it's a XAMPP installation, it's localhost. If it's external, it's the database of that installation. And then you've got index, which creates a table if it doesn't exist, populates the table at the bottom of that form with any records, along with an edit button at the end of that, an edit link here at the end in the fourth column. Then once they click submit, it's going to go ahead and go to the next form, which in this case, the form is going to be contact. The contact form inserts that information they put in the form, whatever it might be, on that home page. We'll say they click the edit button. It's going to go to the edit.php page. Once they hit submit on the edit button or the edit page, it's going to go to the update page. The update page is going to do an update of that record and then do a 4-second spin and then redirect back to the index. Now, one last thing before we take a little break here. I do want to show you real quick in XAMPP how to create your database. Now, I had you guys create your database using your first initial last name, right? And also password first initial last name, correct? So all you need to do with XAMPP running on your computer is you go to localhost, do a localhost prompt. And let me bring my directory down some here. Okay, that's much better. Okay, and on the left side, there's a PHP MyAdmin menu. You click on PHP MyAdmin. And I've already got mine created, but I'm going to create another one. I'm going to call myself John Conkle, J. Conkle. Right, so what you do is, all you need to do is, first thing, create a username. So the Windows one looks a little different than this one. I'm on a Mac. But a Windows one, mine says privileges. What does a Windows say? Privileges tab in PHP MyAdmin. It's not privileges, I know that. I have it in my podcast. I can't remember off the top of my head. Is it users? Yeah, click on users. Yep, it's users tab for Windows. As soon as you click on users for Windows, privileges for Mac, you want to go ahead and click at where it says add a new user. Everybody see that in the Windows side? Add a new user. Now here's where it's a little tricky. Just kind of watch me do mine and you guys can do yours. What you want to do is on the username, and I'm going to do jconkle on mine. Jconkle is the username. Host, you want to make sure and click the drop down, and you guys can do this while I'm talking. So for username, you can put first initial last name. For host, select the drop down and select local. You want to make sure and do local. And what that's going to do is populate that field with local host. The next field is next two fields are your password fields. Just go ahead and put in your first initial last name in those next two fields, the same as your username. Okay. Now, once you've done that, we've done a username, localhost, password. The next one is database for user. It says there should be an option, create database with same name and grant all privileges. Do you have that in your screen? Okay. Then you want to, underneath where it says global privileges, select check all. That way that username now can create other tables and even other databases within PHP MyAdmin. So make sure and do a check all. And notice you have all privileges now for data, structure, administration. And then lastly, you'll click the go button. So go ahead and click the go button. If you're not there, I'll go over one more time. It's first initial last name for username, localhost on host, password is first initial last name, retype is first initial last name. For database for user, create database with same name and grant all privileges, check all, and then click go. When you click go, you should see at the top the actual SQL statement that it ran, and it should say you have added a new user, and in green, meaning it's been successfully created. One of the things you'll also notice is on the left side of your screen, you should now see the name of that database that you just created with your username show up on the left side. If you click on that left side, where mine's J. Conkle, it now has J. Conkle with nothing in it, because I haven't put any tables in it, but now it's ready for my config file information that you just created. Okay, make sense? And so there's nothing in here, it's just a blank database, but you have all, that user has all privileges to do everything that you could do with the database. Now, we won't do it tonight, but there is a way you can come in here, and I could create a table, tell how many fields I want in here, and then go through and manually create the table like we're doing in code, we can do in here as well. Okay? I don't recommend that just because what I mentioned earlier. The other thing I do as a programmer in PHP is this. I will have multiple PHP files in my ionosphere of files that I have, in digital files. And in these files, it basically will just have Um, Table creation. Table creation files of all different types of tables I've ever created in PHP, a .php file. And the reason those are helpful is, over the years, you begin to build records of different types of tables for different uses that you can use in a lot of different databases. And what you can do is, instead of manually doing it this way in PHP MyAdmin or MySQL or even SQL, is if you have the scripts saved like this for creation, you can just do multiple insert statements in your code to call these tables right after a config file to create all the tables you need, okay, and reuse them. And then what I do is generally after that, like I think in week 10 we do this. Have you guys heard of CMS packages, content management systems for web development? They're real popular, like Zoom was one. I'm trying to think of what else. WordPress is one. What is it? Nginx, that's one. And so, you know, all these packages, when you download them, they have one zip file. You throw them in the web server. You start it up, and you start typing in information like what's your SQL information, what's your username, password for your SQL database, what's your database name, and what do you want for the prefix of all your tables. Okay. In week 10 we do that. I'll show you how to do that. Well, the benefit of having one of the first things it does once that first screen is created and saved, the next screen generally in the CMS is actually begin creating all the tables needed for that database to function. That's generally going to call a whole bunch of table creation PHP files. And they'll generally tell you in those installation processes at the very end, it'll say at the very last screen, once it's successful, it'll say, hey, do not forget to delete the create table folder, or the setup folder generally is what they call it. And in that setup folder, you'll find all of the creation files for the tables for that database. Does that make sense? And so that's the way that I and a lot of programmers create tables, is just do it manually. It's not that hard to do once you've done a dozen of them or 100 of them. It's just not that hard to do. They're just simple syntax that you'll learn and become second nature basically on creating. Does that make sense? And so it's easier, maybe not easier on the front end to do it, but once you do it for years, much easier. Because I can walk into any shop that they need a website in PHP, figure out what type of database they need, and I have records already. I might have to tweak a little bit, but I've already got them of tables that I want to use, I've used for years, and just tweak them to my desire for that database creation, for that application. Does that make sense? So it's reusability, and it functions real well doing it that way. So, but one thing you can't do, well actually you can do actually even, if you have rights to a SQL instance on a server, and we'll say the SQL instance called RVC, I can create not only tables, but I can create a database with a command as well. If I know if in that config file I have the information correct for connection, I can actually go ahead and create. But generally, I create the database on the SQL database, on the SQL manager itself. And for the Windows side, you've got MySQL Manager. For PHP side, you got PHP MyAdmin. So anyway, I'm going to exit out of that code, I'm going to exit out of PHP MyAdmin. That's been created. Now when you guys are to browse out to your week 3 for localhost, if you typed everything in correctly, you should get a database. Or it should start functioning correctly. If everything's been typed in correctly, syntax-wise, on your config file, you created the database correctly, you should begin to start playing with it now. So while you're doing that, I'm going to run up and get plates. While I run up and get plates, if you guys want to go out and get drinks at the pop machine, you can, and I will be right back.